Shabbat Shalom, and this is 10 Minutes of Torah. Not the 10 Commandments again, and not one God. Well, actually it is one God, but also it is 10 minutes of Torah. Well, this Shabbat we will be reading the parashah, the Torah portion of V'etchanan, the second Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. This Shabbat also has a special name to it. It is like a couple of other special Shabbatot named after the Haftarah. In this case, of course, the first words of the Haftarah, Nachamu, Nachamu. Shabbat Nachamu it is called. For reasons I'm not quite sure, Shabbat Nachamu became the big time for singles to go to the Catskills, Shabbat Nachamu. So for whatever reason, I guess maybe comfort, that's what the words mean. Who knows? But it became a very big thing, and it still is actually in some places today, Shabbat Nachamu, singles weekend. It is from Isaiah chapter 40, and those are the first words, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Comfort ye, I like the word ye here, comfort ye, oh comfort ye my people, says your God. This is the first of 7 Shabbatot from Tisha B'Av, which was last Sunday, until Rosh Hashanah, which, believe it or not, is only 7 weeks away. So each week we will read a Haftarah, which has to do with being comforted, since this was the time of year where we thought about the destruction of the temple, the exile of our people from the land of Israel. So these 7 weeks leading up to Rosh Hashanah and the first Shabbat Nachamu. But the Torah portion itself is almost an all-star of Torah portions. Because it continues, of course, the farewell discourse of Moses, which began last week. But now Moses turns in a bit of a different direction, and Moses appeals to the people to observe God's laws, and at the same time, not only to observe God's laws, but especially to reject idolatry. The book of Deuteronomy, perhaps more than any other of our books of the Torah, really centers in on this idea that if we're going to continue as a people, we need to believe in one God, and that there is only one God, not just that our God is the greatest, if you will, the mightiest, etc. That sort of was an idea perhaps earlier on, but that there is only one God of all people. So that is a part of the theme, and we see that picked up on today. And that is first in the second reading of the 10 Commandments. I said second reading. Well, there are 2 sets of commandments, the one that Moses brought down from God on the mountain, and then he smashed it, and they were put into the ark, and the second set that Moses brought back that were intact. But when we say two readings of the 10 Commandments, that's actually not what we mean. We mean that in the book of Exodus, when it talks about Mount Sinai, that moment, that's one time the 10 Commandments are in the Torah. But now, as Moses is going back over all of the things that happen in the desert, of course, the most, I would say, amazing, the most eventful moment was revelation on Mount Sinai. Only here in Deuteronomy, Mount Sinai is referred to as Chorev. Interesting, different names, but the same tradition, if you will. Now, the 10 Commandments are pretty important in Judaism, pretty important in Western civilization, pretty important in the history. But not only does this week's Torah portion have the 10 Commandments, it also contains what may be the most famous words of Jewish history. I refer to the Shema, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, translated many different ways. I'll translate it I remember from my childhood. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Many different ways. Good discussion some other year on what exactly that might mean. But the Shema is also in the Torah portion. Could you imagine that? It's like having the Super Bowl and the World Series the same weekend. Well, at least in my world. The Ten Commandments and the Shema, really two of the greatest pieces of Torah that we have. But I want to go back now to the Ten Commandments. Are they the same Ten Commandments that we have in the book of Exodus? So the answer is, like good Jewish answers, yes and no. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were to give a title to each commandment, like not swearing falsely, or honoring your mother and father, etc., even the order, that is exactly the same in Exodus and in our Torah portion today in Devarim and Deuteronomy. But there are some differences in the reasons and descriptions for some of the commandments, and in particular, the commandment to observe Shabbat. Listen to what it says in the book of Exodus. Remember, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and sea, and all that is in them. And God rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay, remember that. And I use that word on purpose because Zachor. Now listen to what it says in Deuteronomy. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. So far, so good. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Interesting. So here in Deuteronomy, it's Shamor, observe the Sabbath day, and the reason for that is that God freed us from slavery. But in the book of the book of Exodus, it isn't observe, but remember, Zachor, remember the Sabbath day. And the reason is because God created heaven and earth. So how is it that we have two separate texts of the Ten Commandments? So, the rabbis couldn't quite figure it out. But you see one of their attempts to solve it in the prayer poem Lecha Dodi. One of the verses starts out, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. God, somehow, when the Ten Commandments were given to us, God was able to say, literally, speak out both sides of God's mouth, if you will. Say both words at once. That comes from Midrash. It says that when God said Shamor, we heard Shamor and Zachor. When God said Zachor, we heard Shamor of Zachor also. In other words, both words were spoken together. But more than that, it reminds us that there are different reasons to observe Shabbat. One, because Shabbat is a celebration of the world. That's why we leave the world at peace over Shabbat. We don't work during Shabbat. So that's a part of it. But it's more than that. It's a reminder that we are free. A free person doesn't get a day of rest. A free person doesn't have time to relax and say, look at my family around me, my friends around me. I'm going to services. So a free person, Shabbat represents that day of rest. And even if you have to work all week long to make a living and it's difficult, one day of rest. Creation, letting the world be as creation, and working, letting ourselves also be enjoying this day. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. God spoke those words, observe and remember, all at once. Well, this has been 10 Minutes of Torah. Not the 10 Commandments again, actually it will be. And not one God, and yes, it will be that too, but what we had today was 10 Minutes of Torah. Shabbat Shalom.